What? Why are you shaking your head?
You're welcome.
Hey guys, and welcome to the Week 2 edition of the UFL Breakdown. I'm here with millionaire maker winner and one of the winningest spring football DFS players of all time, Neil Orfield. Neil, how you doing?
Be doing a lot better if our Brahmas had won last week. That was a pretty rough week for the boys, but feeling good that they're going to get back on track this week. Excited to talk UFL. Glad for UFL to be back tomorrow. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing well. I thought that Arlington San Antonio game was tremendously tilting for a variety of reasons. Seeing the Brahmas play so bad, the way they distributed touches in both backfields was incredibly frustrating. Yeah. But we will talk about all that shortly. Before we get into the games, guys, just wanted to note that if you're betting on any player props or if you're playing UFL DFS, you are definitely going to want to subscribe to either our UFL package or our all-in package, which includes UFL, college football, NFL, and the Fantasy Points data suite. You can actually save 20% on the all-in package with promo code ALLUFL. Here's what you get in our UFL product, though. You get projections for every player and every game. You get main slate DFS ownership projections, a weekly written breakdown of the DFS slate. That's often paywalled. This week's is actually free, so you can sample that if you'd like. Just head over to fantasypoints.com. You also get access to our paywalled Discord, where I provide notes on coach speak, insider info, breakdowns of single game showdown and Sunday only DFS slates. And you also get our official picks for player props. Player props are a huge reason to get in our paywalled Discord. Earlier today, Neil, get this. ESPN Bet listed Abram Smith's, the running back for the DC Defenders. They listed his receiving prop at 39.5. Okay. This was incredible. Our projection is like 6. They took it down in about 10 or 15 minutes, but obviously I was in our paywall Discord, at everyone. Bet as much as you feel comfortable with on the under here, because this is an incredible line. So definitely want to get in the Discord if you are planning on doing any sort of betting or, like I said, any DFS. All right, with that out of the way, Neil, I think we can go into these games. Our first game here, Friday night kickoff. It's the Birmingham Stallions at the Michigan Panthers. Birmingham is favored by 2.5. I believe this opened right around 1.5. Birmingham got bet up a little bit. Total is 38.5. On the injury front, CJ Maribel is out with a personal issue, so it's Ricky Pearson week. COC Mariner is listed as probable with a wrist issue. He is expected to play and is active on the depth chart and everything. The Mariner injury, I did just want to note, I caught when he got hurt last week. He only missed about 3 plays, then he came back into the game, so really not anything to worry about there. Based on everything that I have seen so far. Neil, before we talk the DFS side of this, do you have any interest on either side of this game from a betting perspective? Birmingham, Michigan, with the spread being 2.5 in Birmingham's favor.
Man, that seems about right. I think Birmingham probably should be favored here. I might take the points there. 1.5 point seems like not a huge spread, but also with the way UFL scoring goes, I think I'd probably take the points on Birmingham, if anything.
Yeah, definitely good to shop around there. DK's hanging a 2.5 on Birmingham. FanDuel's got 1.5. So always look around for UFL lines. Generally, you see bigger spreads too in site to site on UFL lines compared to like something like NFL. I really don't think I have a lean there. I kind of like Michigan. I don't hate the Michigan money line. I think they have a pretty good chance to unseat Birmingham as the best team in the league, but I don't want to make any sweeping conclusions after one poor game from Birmingham. We can start with the Stallions side of this game for DFS purposes. Neil, I'm really excited to talk about the backfield, so let's do that first. Ricky Pearson will be leading things this week. CJ Maribel, like I noted, out with a personal issue, so it'll be him and Larry Roundtree. Now, we have seen this in the past. Let me pull up my notes here. Pearson set season high marks in backfield weighted opportunity share at 59% in week 5 last year and 84% in week 8 in his 2 games without Maribel. Maribel also earned 86% of backfield weighted opportunity when Pearson missed week 10. So I'm anticipating roughly 70% of the backfield workload going to Ricky Pearson. That makes for a pretty compelling play at just 6,800. They will rotate Roundtree in. There's always the risk Roundtree could steal like an inside the 5 carry or something like that, which would obviously be frustrating. But at 6,800, Neil, Person looking at, like I said, 70% of backfield work, that feels like a pretty strong play. Granted, obviously the ownership is there to match.
Yeah, no, I think Person a phenomenal play. I also interesting. I was just reading your article, Jake, and now I tried to go to our projections page to look at the projected ownership, and it says subscription required. So I'm not sure what happened on my account here. I can't currently see our ownership projections.
We have Person at 33% here. Let me email you my my Excel sheet, and then that will get you caught up here. But what do you think about 33% ownership for 6,800 Ricky Person?
I think it's too low, if anything. Probably like
Really?
yeah. I mean, I think he's going to see probably the majority of the backfield work. We think he's a pretty talented running back. He's only 6,800. I feel like my philosophy has kind of changed this year in that I mean, eating a lot of chalk this year. Like in general, we saw week 1, Marcus Sims was in, I believe he was in the winning lineup, where that lineup that gapped the field had 9 points out of an expensive Marcus Sims because he just got like significant points from every other spot. Now you probably still want to find a contrarian piece or two to go into most of your lineup, but like generally projections are pretty good, and like we just kind of want to lean into volume here, and like for most of your lineup you just want to lean into that volume. And I think Ricky Person is pretty likely to get that volume. He's if you were getting that ownership just because of the price tag, I would want to lean away, but the price is too low. We're expecting him to see pretty significant volume. He's already really involved as a pass catching back, running a lot of routes. So yeah, I don't really see anything to dislike about Ricky Person. 33%, like, feels like a lot, but like, I don't know, Jacob Sailors was 50% last week, and that was not enough. I think 33% feels low to me.
Yeah, so I think my only pushback on the ownership is that there are a handful of other really strong running back plays on this slate that we will talk about a little bit later. Kirk Merritt looks really strong in our projections. Nate McCrary looks pretty good. Day Hunter and Jarvion Howard both have pretty compelling upside cases, and they're lower priced than a guy like Person. So that gives me some hesitancy. Plus, this Michigan defense is quite good. They returned 10 of 11 starters from last year. They looked very good in week 1. I expect them to put up a pretty good fight against Birmingham this week. So I would be a little concerned about efficiency, but I mean, like you said, the volume's going to be there and the price is right, especially at running back. These kind of mid-price guys that could push for 15 plus carries are really great plays because it helps you get up to the expensive wide receivers that we know will actually get 6, 8, 10 targets, and that's very, very valuable because some of these lower priced wide receivers, there are some decent plays this week, but always quite risky, especially relative to their running back counterparts. All right, Alex Magoo really, really struggled last week. He was pressured on almost half of his dropbacks. This Birmingham offensive line posted a 23 PFF pass blocking grade, which, I mean, I don't know if everyone here is familiar with PFF grades. 23 is about as bad as it can possibly get for a single unit for a game from PFF. And Magoo really struggled throwing the ball. That said, he did run for 84 yards and still put up a pretty mediocre, I believe, 13 or so fantasy points. He's the starter again this week. Obviously, we know Magoo has great ability. I've rattled off the stat in my content plenty of times. And last week, Magoo's responsible for one of the 5 greatest seasons by fantasy points per game from a professional football quarterback of all time. We saw Adrian Martinez also land in the top 5 last season. So we know these Birmingham Stallions quarterbacks have incredible fantasy upside. Neil, this is a tricky situation to price, though, because, I mean, we have to anticipate the leash for Magoo is going to be pretty short. Skip Holtz said in his post-game press conference that he gave heavy consideration to putting Matt Corral in the game last week. He did say he thought Alex would get it together. That never really happened. I mean, I wouldn't be shocked here if Magoo threw like an interception on the first drive. He could get benched almost immediately. That's really scary, but like I said, the upside here is really, really strong. Only 9,500. He could obviously push for 30 fantasy points. Where are you at on Magoo? And obviously it's extra tough because Birmingham's a tough team to stack. A lot of spread out route shares here, but Deion Kane did emerge as a full-time player last week.
I think I still like Magoo. I agree with you. Like I'm more afraid than I was last weekend, and we had some concern last week. Like he was pretty late named as a starter, so it was pretty likely that there was going to be some sort of a split. So a little bit of concern. But after he played so poorly, I do have concerns that he's going to be pulled. But also, he's a pretty strong fantasy producer. Typically, he's going to get that first opportunity. So like, it's, you often say, like, if a player is doing well, they're going to stay in the game. If they're not doing well, they probably weren't going to put up a big score anyway. So, like, maybe a concern for cash, but like for GPPs, you're just shooting for that biggest upside. And I think quarterback is still the one position where I'm probably, like, in general leaning into chalk, but like quarterback, I'm probably going to continue to spread it out, just because week to week you see different stacks put up big scores, and it's often not who you expect. So I think the ownership is pretty fair on Magoo. Like, we're not, if you were getting like, I don't know, 25-30% ownership, then at that point I would start having some hesitation, like, okay, I'm going to lean far away from that because of the risk. But we're projecting for mid-teens ownership. I think that feels about right. Like, I don't know that I'll be above that. I think I'll probably be pretty close to that number. But yeah, I think it's fair ownership, and there are some receivers that I like there with Magoo. I think I kind of had the idea. You gave me the idea of Davion Davis with Magoo, because the two had success previously. I leaned into that last week, and it didn't really work out, but like, you could see that there was the upside there. Like, Davis was, when he was out on the field, he was targeted a few times. It was not a great game fantasy wise, but he did see a few targets. I think if they get rolling, those two could really work together. I love that we've seen it before. So I think that there are some stacks that I'm kind of intrigued by, that I'm interested in leaning into there with Magoo. Deion Kane, obviously still a pretty strong play, projected for single digit ownership at 8,100. I think he's a strong enough stacking partner. Malik Turner, only 3,800. So yeah, it's not totally clear who you want to stack him with, but like, I kind of like all three of those. Like, Deion Kane is just like, he's the stud. Pair him with his number one receiver. He's expensive, but still getting single digit ownership. Malik Turner, he's the value play. He's only 3,800, too cheap for his role. And then Davion Davis projected to be pretty contrarian, like only projected for 4% ownership currently, and also 4,700. So I kind of like all three of those as stacking partners. And then also Jay Sternberger, now listed as the tight end 1 on the depth chart, was not last week. I fell for it, Jake, the trap, the Jordan Thomas trap. He was, so frequently used as a target when they were going for like the 2-point, 3-point conversion. So it was like, it's kind of if I were better with stats, Jake, that's kind of something that I've thought about. I would want to look into how that translates over time, like players who are targeted often in 2-point conversions in like the NFL, like, does that lead to more touchdowns eventually? I think that would be something that like would intuitively make sense to me. And Jordan Thomas is the prime example of that for me. Like, they target him so frequently and with success last year on those conversion plays. So when he was listed as a tight end 1, I was like, okay, they saw the success. They're finally going to give him his chance. And that didn't happen at all. So Jay Sternberger also somebody to consider. Jordan Thomas, more of a showdown play, I think. Sadly, did not really work out there. But yeah, I think we have some decent options there, even if they're not like top options on the board. Are you playing much Magoo?
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm struggling with the most is right now we've got Magoo for around 17% ownership. We actually have Teamu for a little bit more. I could see that getting pinched. I could see them both landing maybe right around 20. I feel fairly confident in saying Manny Wilkins is going to be the highest owned quarterback on this slate. I'm always tempted by a guy who's had the fantasy success that Magoo has had. I don't know that I'm going to get above 20 or 25%. And I think part of that is just because he is really tough to stack. Last week, Deion Kane had a 75% route share. He easily led the team with 7 targets. Next closest player had 3. Next closest player in terms of route share was Davion Davis at 58%. Jordan Thomas actually clocked in at 53%, Jay Sternberger at 36%, and then, some handful of other receivers sort of in between those two in terms of route share. Now that Sternberger is the starting tight end, I would sort of anticipate that maybe he would push for that 55% route share and Jordan Thomas would be relegated more to the 35%. But I don't know that I'm super confident in that. I mean, this could just be a very gross split, which makes it hard. I mean, Sternberger's still fairly expensive. I mean, for me, it's probably just Deion Kane, a little bit of Davion Davis. And then I also think you could maybe go Marlon Williams if you want like a really deep sleeper for some larger field stuff, if only because Amari Rodgers is inactive this week. So we could see Marlon Williams play both on the outside and in the slot. That wouldn't surprise me at all. But I mean, all these Birmingham wide receivers, except for Deion Kane and maybe Davion Davis, are capped at 55, 60% of routes, which is, just really, really tough. I really don't mind Magoo, naked, especially because Michigan is a team that gets a lot of pressure that should force him out of the pocket, force him to run. I mean, he's a guy who could hit the 100-yard bonus like we saw Adrian Martinez do several times last year. Like I said, Magoo, 84 rushing yards last week. I think we covered Birmingham pretty extensively here. We can move on to the Michigan side. One note before we talk Michigan, Neil, is that I think in futures markets, an interesting play here would be betting on whoever loses this game to win the UFL championship, if only because you'll get a pretty significant discount on odds. Right now, last I checked on DraftKings, I believe Birmingham was about plus 275 and Michigan was plus 450. Getting something like plus 350 on Birmingham or plus 550 on Michigan after what we've seen, I think would be a pretty interesting bet. So I'll definitely be looking at that after this game. But the Michigan side, Bryce Perkins played awesome last week. I mean, that run that he had for a touchdown was absolutely incredible. I know that made some rounds on Twitter. The tough thing with Bryce Perkins, though, is that, the broadcast noted and Twitter reports noted that they kind of wanted this to be a 50-50 split. Now, Perkins played too well for a 50-50 split to really make sense. We also saw Danny Etling get absolutely crushed on a hit to end the first half. I don't really think that contributed much to his playing time because they showed video footage of him near the 10. He was clearly telling the trainer, like, yeah, man, I'm totally fine. I just, got rocked. So right now I'm projecting roughly 75%-ish of dropbacks for Bryce Perkins. The problem is that, similar to Magoo, if he comes out a little slow, we probably see a bit more Etling. If he comes out hot, though, I mean, he could definitely push for 100% of snaps. On a per 4 quarters basis, Bryce Perkins is averaging 25.4 fantasy points. Now, he's only played 11 quarters, so this is a very small sample, but man, he has looked incredible for fantasy. The other nice thing about Perkins, especially relative to a guy like Magoo, is that we know whose top 2 receivers are. It's Marcus Sims and COC Mariner. And we also saw Malik Turner work in for about 93% of routes. And I believe he earned 5 targets last week. Neil, how do you feel about Perkins and stacking him up in tournaments? Because, again, there are some serious rotational risks here, but man, he looked good.
First of all, I need to correct myself. As I was reading off Birmingham, I listed Malik Turner as one of the receivers that I was interested in playing. Then I was starting looking at this. I was like, wait, Malik Turner is not on Birmingham. So yeah, Malik Turner, it looks like a great play for Michigan, not Birmingham, as that value option. Here's where the ownership is getting a little bit higher than I think I would like to play in Bryce Perkins. Like he might be splitting this week. Like you said, Danny Etling got hurt. That probably led to Bryce Perkins getting more playing time than was projected, than they were planning on playing him. So there are some reasons to be concerned with playing Bryce Perkins. And we have him at the highest ownership, right, of any quarterback. Let me see.
No, only 11% right now.
Oh,
behind Magoo, Teamu, and Manny Wilkins.
Oh yeah. Going back to last year, Manny Wilkins and Bryce Perkins, for some reason, just the names, I screw them up constantly. So I had gone away from I think that is a fair number, like 11%, not concerned about that at all. He did play well. So, on the other hand, I said, I don't think he was expected. I don't think they were planning on using him as a full-time quarterback, but he played well enough as a full-time quarterback that I think 11% is pretty fair ownership. I think that's a number that I would probably like to get on top of for Bryce Perkins. And really just 3 pretty straightforward 3 wide receivers for him in Marcus Sims, COC Mariner, Malik Turner. COC Mariner, kind of the chalk last week, didn't exactly work out, but still a very, very strong role for COC Mariner. Marcus Sims, the top receiver, and then Malik Turner is for Michigan, the value option. Those are the only 3 that I'm playing. I'm not playing Samson Nakua despite the touchdown last week. I think those are some very strong options, which makes it easy. It does make it a little bit easier, especially because now we're dealing with a contest that's only 2,900 entries. The field has dropped significantly, so we want to lean more into the sure things. And I think that this wide receiver set, 3 of the more sure thing wide receivers, at least in terms of opportunities. I like it. I'll probably be above weight to 11% there. And I like all 3 of the receivers. As far as preferences? Do you have, how would you rank these three receivers for Michigan, or is there anybody else that you would play there?
I think after week one, I'm just a little bit higher on Sims than Mariner. Obviously, Malik Turner is a great value option. My one concern with Turner, and this, really isn't impacting his projection too much, but I do think it's something I'm going to be thinking about in tournaments. Jalen Moore got really great coach speak from Mike Nolan in the offseason. He mentioned Jalen Moore and Malik Turner in the same breath. Now, Jalen Moore was inactive in week one. Xavier Malone basically didn't play on offense at all. He's largely just a returner. Maybe they're just going to use Jalen Moore as a returner, but I do think there's a chance Jalen Moore could work in for like 30 or 40% of routes and push Malik Turner to closer to a part-time role. So that would be my one hesitancy there with Turner. I mean, that said, he's still so cheap that he could easily get you there on 60% of routes. So I don't know that that's a huge concern. But again, when I'm making my tournament lineups, I don't think I want too much Malik Turner exposure because there is just a little bit of risk Jalen Moore plays more than, anybody projecting these games would anticipate. So I'd probably rank them Sims, Mariner, and then Turner, but they're all very, very close, and I want to mix and match. I'd also think with Perkins, if you're playing like a $50 or $100 single entry, or if you're playing in the 3-3-3, I would imagine Perkins clocks in with a little bit lower ownership than we project because people probably want to play the more sure things. Last week, I was pretty surprised that Perkins only came in at about 5%. We had a pretty aggressive projection on him, but it really didn't seem to boost his ownership up too much. I think we cover the passing game pretty good. Backfield here is presenting a really nice value in Nate McCrary, who is only 5,600. Initially I sort of thought, sure, McCrary's listed as RB1, but a lot of teams will just list their, first, second down back as the overall RB1, or just, maybe he's the guy that's going to take the first drive. But I did sort of expect Colburn would work in for just a little bit more, action in terms of raw snaps and weighted opportunity. No, I mean, McCrary was clearly the lead back. He was basically in the equivalent of Colburn's role last year. And the best part about this is, he's looking at probably 55 to 60% of snaps and backfield weighted opportunity. But the best part is he's going to get, clear advantage in the red zone in terms of overall touches. He got all three backfield red zone touches last week. I'd anticipate probably about 70% of backfield red zone touches going to McCrary moving forward. I think they'll give him a clear preference inside the 5, especially if they're coming like out of a timeout or out of a quarter. I think they'll absolutely sub in McCrary ahead of Colburn. I mean, at only 5,600, he feels like a really strong play. Probably not quite as strong as guys like Ricky Person, Kirk Merritt, but to me, the next tier down, we've got him at around 20% ownership. What do you think, Neil?
Yeah, no, I think very, very strong play. That was one I leaned heavily into Nate McCurry last week. Loved the role. Did not work out for me, but I'll go right back there to Nate McCurry this week. The price is just too cheap. The ownership, I said 33% for Ricky Person felt a little bit low. 21% for McCurry also feels too low for me. I do think that I'm going to be above weight to that. And another thing that Furby pointed out in the Discord this week, he was saying, can I swap all of my flex wide receivers to running backs now? Is it too late to do that? Like that's a good reminder. Like that's kind of what it was last year too. Like you generally wanted running backs in the flex. I think that's probably going to be the case once again this week. So probably going to take an overweight approach to a lot of running backs just because I won't play that many receivers in the flex. I think McCrary is a fantastic option. Once again, a little bit too cheap. Will you go to any Matthew Colburn at 7,500?
I don't think so. I just don't really see a compelling upside case there, especially if we're anticipating, like I said, about 75 or 80% of dropbacks for a guy like Bryce Perkins. He's not going to check down quite as much as a guy like Etling will. Plus, like I said, not having the goal line role. I mean, McCrary, I think the upside case is pretty strong. He gets you maybe 80 yards from scrimmage and 2 touchdowns. That's a pretty decent score right there. Colburn, I don't quite think has that in his range of outcomes, barring, maybe Michigan's playing from behind a lot and they might prefer Colburn in that role. But still, I mean, McCrary ran more routes than him last week. Yeah. So I'm not necessarily sure about that. I don't think I'm going to get to Colburn at all this week. Really do like me some Nate McCrary, though. All right. I think we are good to move on here to the second game. This is our only Saturday game. Memphis Showboats at the DC Defenders. The Showboats are 8-point dogs. Total here is 37. No injuries of note, which is really nice. The big news here, though, Ken Wisenhunt is back as the team's head coach and offensive coordinator. I kind of thought initially that he might just be like dipping out for the entire season. Turned out it was, I guess, just like some sort of family emergency and he had to step away for a week. totally understandable on Wisenhunt's part. That said, though, I do think this changes the projections for Memphis a little bit. Interim head coach Jim Turner was all about playing everybody as much as possible. He even said, the following week, if he was still the interim head coach, that like the inactive players would be active and he would play them, and he still wants to rotate everyone as much as possible, and it would take him until later in the season to play the best players. Wisenhunt has been extremely I'm struggling to find the words, non-committal about basically anything regarding his team. His press conferences have been such a bore. But he did say, or at least he seemed to suggest more than Jim Turner, that he's going to play the best players. So we could see a guy like Jonathan Adams, who's only around a 70% route share last week, push for maybe something closer to 90%. The problem is, though, this team just really isn't good to stack. Their implied team total is only about 15.5. The quarterback situation is really gross. I don't really view either EJ Perry or Troy Williams as great fantasy assets, especially when we're projecting, basically an even split here. Yeah, Neil, what do you think about these Memphis pass catchers? I think we can pretty easily skip over the quarterbacks, but, guys like Jonathan Adams and Kwame Lassiter are a little interesting, especially if you believe the spread and assume Memphis gets down here.
Yeah, I mean, definitely interesting. Jonathan Adams, not running wind sprints last week. He had a real role. They were targeting him. He did well. 6,600, totally fair price tag. Ownership seems fine. Yeah, I think Jonathan Adams, like, I'll probably be right with the field there. Like, we've seen him out there with the full-time role not succeed. So I don't want to read too much into the success he had in week 1, given how often last year he was out there running a ton of routes and then just not really being targeted or not really being involved in the game plan. So I don't want to take a huge overweight stance there on Jonathan Adams, but I think he's totally fine at reasonable ownership there, 19%. Kwame Lassiter, really interesting to me at low ownership at 4,800. I think that's a number that I want to be certainly above the field. We have him at single digit ownership. I'll probably get to double digit ownership on Kwame Lassiter. Feels like a pretty strong play. I think those two in particular interest me. I don't think I'm going to go to much, if any, Elijah Stove. He was listed as a starter last week, and I played a little bit last week. That did not work out well. Not going back to Kyle Oxley. I really think it's probably just those two for me, unless I'm forgetting somebody. Is there anybody else that you're planning on playing for Memphis?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it for me. Elijah Stove did run 67% of routes last week, which was certainly encouraging. The problem is, I mean, Eli Stove has been around, I believe, since the 2022 USFL. He's never done anything. I mean, I'm not a big believer in his raw skill or upside. I think my favorite play, at least for larger field tournaments of this group, would be Kwame Lassiter. Like Neil said, coming in right around 3 or 4% ownership, there's a lot of pretty compelling wide receiver plays in the 4K or so range. Guys like Jacob Harris, Cornell Powell, who are going to draw significant ownership. Kwame Lassiter is going to fly a little bit under the radar. Like I said, if Ken Wisenhunt is serious about playing the best players, we've already seen, Lassiter led the team in routes last week. Maybe he goes from 75% to something like 90. He actually almost caught a touchdown. I believe it was either the play before or 2 plays before Jonathan Adams caught his touchdown. They had a target to Lassiter. He was open. It was a bit of an overthrow. So yeah, he's an interesting play for sure in larger field tournaments. I really like lineups where you go basically all chalk, and then instead of a guy like Cornell Powell, you just slide in Kwame Lassiter. And, to me, that's a pretty good tournament lineup. Yep. Backfield here was interesting. Jalen Jackson ended up leading the backfield in weighted opportunity. Now, Deneric Prince led the backfield in both snap share and route share, actually logged a 68% route share, which is pretty great. My anticipation moving forward, and I wrote this up in a bit more detail in my article, which again is free on fantasypoints.com. If you guys want to read it, my anticipation moving forward is that, this is a bit of a blip. I expect Deneric Prince to earn about 60% or so of backfield weighted opportunity moving forward. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe Jalen Jackson rotated a bit more in the red zone, but I didn't really pick up from watching the film a ton of rhyme or reason to why they had Prince in or Jackson in at certain moments. I think they feel pretty comfortable with both guys in either situation. They're similarly sized too, so it really could be a 50-50 split at the goal line. Problem there is that, Deneric Prince is fairly expensive. And again, Memphis is just not projecting for, or not implied, I should say, for many points at all. About a 15.5 point implied team total here is massive underdogs. Do you have any interest in this backfield, Neil?
Let's see. Deneric Prince, 7,000. Yeah, that's a little bit of a tough pill to swallow. Jalen Jackson 5,000. I don't know, like Deneric Prince. I think if I were to play one, it would actually be I would pay up for Deneric Prince just because of that passing game involvement. Like he was running a lot of routes. So maybe if they do get involved, or sorry, if they do get behind, they could get into a game script where he just racks up 4 catches in the second half. And that's really valuable. So I think Deneric Prince is like sort of intriguing for like really large field tournaments. And we don't have like really large, but like I think in the 2,900 person like main contest, I think he is playable, somebody that I'll probably have some exposure to, or I'll be playing the mini max. I'll have some Deneric Prince in the mini max also. So yeah, I think he's playable. I think I like him better than Jalen Jackson, but we don't know if Cabote is going to be active this week, right? We don't have.
Entirely possible that Cabote could be active. I would be shocked if they kept 3 running backs active. I would figure if he's active, it's at the expense of Jalen Jackson, and I'd largely just give him Jackson's workload in our projections. Certainly something to keep in mind, though. Also wanted to note with Prince, similar to these wide receivers, if Whisenhunt's serious about playing the best players, maybe that means a few extra snaps for a guy like Prince. That said, historically speaking, Whisenhunt has always had a bit of an aversion to a true bell cow running back. So I would be pretty shocked if Prince pushed for like 75% or 80% of snaps, but maybe 65% is a reasonable snap ceiling there for Deneric Prince. And you could make a case for it in the largest field tournaments. Before we talk DC, just wanted to say thank you guys so much for all the comments. Really appreciate everyone tuning in right now, whether you're live or watching the recording. Obviously could not do this without you guys. Neil, DC Defenders, Jordan Teamu is projecting for a good amount of ownership. And, historically, Neil, my thing with Teamu, we've seen him in spring football for as long as it's been around. When he's popular, I generally want to stay away. And then when people think he sucks and he's only drawing, 5, 6, 7% ownership, that's generally when I want to fire. The nice thing with Teamu is that this was a fairly concentrated passing offense. We know he's got Ty Scott, who led the entire league in targets last year. He's also got Chris Rowland, who's in that slot role and, might get a few carries as well. And then Cornell Powell emerged. I believe he's just 4,600 this week in a full-time role, was right around 80% of routes. Logged another 6 or 7 targets. So, this is a pretty condensed passing offense. But I don't know. I'm a little bit more iffy on a guy like Teamu, especially if he's going to be around 20% ownership. Where are you at on DC's passing attack?
Yeah, and again, this is quarterbacks are the one spot where maybe I don't lean into the chalk just because it is a pretty volatile position week to week. Other than Adrian Martinez last year, for the most part, it's generally not that consistent. And like you said, like Teamu, we've seen him have really, really poor scores. Like he's always very involved. We know he's going to have opportunities, but he can still, with opportunities, put up single-digit fantasy points. So if he's going to be one of the chalkier quarterbacks on the slate and one of the more expensive quarterbacks on the slate, I guess they're all kind of similar in price. But I think I'll probably be underweight to Teamu, but that's not going to keep me from playing his pass catcher. So I think I'll take an underweight approach to Teamu himself. Ty Scott looks phenomenal. We are projecting him for the most ownership, I assume, of any wide receiver on the slate. I think that's well deserved. Like he was clearly the focal point of that offense. He's a talented receiver. The price tag is palatable at 8,400. So yeah, Ty Scott, great play. Obviously chalky. You're going to need to find somewhere else to get different if you play Ty Scott. But no, I think I'll be probably not too far off from that 40% we are projecting the field at. Cornell Powell, 4,500. Just the price is too cheap. Also, are they the 2 chalkiest receivers on the entire slate? Those 2 right there. Yes, they are.
They'll certainly be up there. I would anticipate. I feel very confident in thinking that Ty Scott is going to be the highest owned wide receiver on the slate, probably the highest owned player on the slate overall. Powell, I'm a little back and forth on because there are other decent 4K options. Like a guy like Jacob Harris could absorb a bit of that ownership. So, 32% could be a bit high for him, but I mean, he projects really strongly.
Yeah. And I think he's, NFL receiver, Super Bowl ring winner.
Two Super Bowl rings, two national championship rings. I mean, he's the most decorated player in the entire league.
Yeah, I mean, he's worth every penny. I think the ownership's not too far off on Cornell Powell. Like, I don't know if I want 32%, but I probably won't be far. Like, I think that's a pretty fair number. I also think Chris Rowland, a really strong play at 5,700. Just their primary slot receiver, should just rack up some PPR points there. So I do like Rowland also. I think all three of those are strong plays for DC. Let me see. Is there anybody else? Yeah, Javon Antonio is like kind of borderline. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to play any more McKinney on the main slate. I think he's like borderline playable, but again, I think generally you can just eat the chalk somewhat. So I don't think you really need to go there.
Yeah, I think the one guy that I wanted to make a bit of an upside case for was Chris Rowland. 15% ownership, especially if we're bullish on this DC passing attack, is really interesting, if only because, he caught a touchdown last week. And I noted in my week 1 preview that if you go back to 2024, these DC slot receivers got peppered with targets inside the 10. So I do think a big part of their, red zone passing offense revolves around the slot. And, that certainly plays itself into the potential for a multi-touchdown performance from Rowland. Would always be a little bit worried, though, that Jaden Mickens would work in. I think the route share for both Powell and Ty Scott is a lot more secure than it is for Rowland. But yeah, definitely solid play. Also wanted to put a bow on Ty Scott. He's top 5 last year in yards per route run and first downs per route run, which is like the best indication of wide receiver skill that I can, basically imagine. And he's out there for every route. He earned 10 targets last week. So at 8,400, I wrote it up in my article. I said he's pretty much a screaming value until he hits 9,500, maybe 10K. Really strong play there in Ty Scott. The backfield is interesting, Neil. I mean, Abram Smith did nothing last week, but he played on over 70% of snaps. He was out there for about 80% of routes. Obviously, we know what Abram Smith is capable of when he does get fed. And to me, I've always sort of treated him like the UFL's version of Derrick Henry, where, if we expect DC to lose, I don't really want anything to do with Abram Smith because he's not going to catch any passes. But in a game where DC's favored by 8 points, and, I wouldn't be surprised if this game played a little slow. Memphis's pass defense looked all right last week. This could be a 15, maybe even pushing 20 touch game for a guy like Abram Smith. Certainly tempting there. What do you think about him?
Yeah, I think it looks like a strong play, just given that spread. I think that it's and he's not getting a ton of ownership, so he is fairly expensive. But I think Abram Smith is a pretty strong option. I'm going back to our what's the hang on one second here. I'm working my way through our spreadsheet, and I'm rusty at using our spreadsheet a little bit here. Memphis they only gave up 95 rushing yards last week. Interesting. I would have expected it to be more, but no, I think Abram Smith with that big of a role and a spread, I think he's a strong play at pretty low ownership.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I really like the pairing with the DC Defenders defense. Again, I think we can basically just treat him like we would treat a Derrick Henry in NFL DFS. So certainly keep that in mind. And, if Derrick Henry was, the Ravens were favored by 8 and Derrick Henry was looking at 6% ownership, I would certainly be tempted by that. Price is going to keep that ownership down a little bit, but I do think it's worth taking some shots on. Or excuse me, I believe I said 6%. We have Abram Smith projected for around 12. Still, I think a decent shot there. I don't have any interest in the backups for DC, so I think we can just move on to this next game. It's the Houston Roughnecks at the Arlington Renegades. Houston is a 10-point underdog here. Total is 39. On the injury front, Isaiah Winstead was limited on Wednesday with a groin issue. I fully expect him to play, but this is worth keeping an eye on. He did finish the game last week, so not too worried there. Neil, big news for Houston, and I can't say I'm surprised knowing my boy Curtis Johnson. Anthony Brown is starting again. I mean, Anthony Brown looked absolutely awful last week. Nolan Henderson gave this team a legitimate spark. I mean, sure, Henderson's very limited as a passer, but he can run, and, he was actually moving this offense down the field. I really don't know what to do with a team like Houston when, this could just be total disaster from them. We know the coaching isn't good, and I really think Anthony Brown's probably not fit to start in the UFL. I'm not really sure how to treat this. It's tough because, guys like Kurt Merritt, Justin Hall, the offense was so concentrated around them last week. But I mean, we have to price in the risk of complete offensive disaster. I guess, Neil, we can start by talking about Merritt. He's only 6,300. He earned an opportunity on 24% of Houston's plays last week. Sure, it was only 4 targets and 8 carries, but I mean, they only ran 50 plays. They didn't run a single play inside the 10, or I believe maybe they ran one. I put this in more detail in my article, but the usage for Merritt blew my mind. I mean, 70% of snaps, 73% of routes. This was really, really great usage, especially for a guy that they love as a pass catcher. And based on how much they were running him between the tackles, it seems like he's the favorite for goal line carries too. So, I've tried to push Merritt's projection down more than what we have. We've got him right around 13 fantasy points. I can't get it much lower than this. And that speaks to how great the role is. But again, I'm very, very concerned about offensive efficiency. Is there that much touchdown upside there if we anticipate, a half of a game or even a full game from Anthony Brown? I don't know. I mean, where are you at on Kirk Merritt?
Yeah, phenomenal play. I'm looking through the running backs right now, just like going down the list. I'm like, all right, who do I want? Because like I'm thinking if I'm going to be, I feel like I keep saying I'm going to be overweight on every running back, and I'm like, do I need to find somebody? But I might just be overweight on all the running backs because I'm just going to play running backs in the flex for the most part. And I think Kirk Merritt, another one, like he's 33% ownership, 6,300. They are 8-point dogs, so like probably going to be playing in a game script that really works for Kirk Merritt. I think he's talented. I'm on board the Kirk Merritt train. I think we just lean into these running backs once again. And I'm super into it for Kirk Merritt. I will be probably, I don't know if also I'm going to be above the field necessarily on all of these guys. Like I'm looking at, but maybe like 33% feels like a fair number at the very least, and one that I would not be surprised if I end up a little bit overweight there.
Yeah, I have a hard time not liking Merritt this week. 87% of backfield weighted opportunity last week. And again, if the Houston offense is just a little bit more competent than what we saw last week, that should translate to a really great fantasy score. Next closest player in terms of backfield weighted opportunity percentage in week 1 was CJ Maribel at 68%. He's obviously inactive this week. So huge gap between Merritt and the next closest active running back in terms of week 1 usage by, percentage of total weighted opportunity. But of course, for that to turn into actual fantasy points, we need Houston to move the ball down the field just a little bit. We'll see if that can happen. But yeah, I definitely want to take some shots on Kirk Merritt because it really seems like Houston is treating them like their version of Christian McCaffrey. Maybe he's not going to play the 90% snap share that Christian McCaffrey gets, but 70% of snaps in an 8-team league like the UFL is really, really nice. Justin Hall, this is another tough one, probably tougher than Merritt because he doesn't have that carry floor that Merritt offers. He's got a decent projection. He's 9K. I might need to bring his ownership down a little bit. 20% feels like a lot for a guy who's catching passes from Anthony Brown. Do you have any interest there? Clearly the passing offense was focused on Justin Hall. They obviously love him as a receiver. He's very talented. I've always sort of comped him to like the spring football version of Antonio Brown. Very small, moves very well, great body control. But he's catching passes from Anthony Brown, Neil. This is a very tough situation to assess.
Which of these quarterbacks do you think is better for the receivers, Nolan Henderson or Anthony Brown?
I think Nolan Henderson for sure.
Okay.
That said, maybe Anthony Brown maybe there was just something going on in his head. He allegedly won the job in camp. You have to assume he brings something to the table that the coaches have seen that we aren't, but this is also the dumbest coaching staff in professional football. So yeah. I can't say that with like a lot of certainty there. Right now we're pricing in about a 50-50 split. I am anticipating either Brown gets benched or a significant package for Nolan Henderson. Reports have already indicated that we will see, a little bit of Henderson regardless of how Brown plays. So definitely something to keep in mind there. Maybe Henderson could save him if Brown gets benched immediately, but man, Brown played awful last week and they still gave him an entire half. I thought he could have been easily benched at the end of the first quarter. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I was going to say, like, well, it'd be better for Justin Hall, I think, if Anthony Brown gets benched and we get Nolan Henderson there. Like, the offense moves a little bit better. But then I'm like, Nolan Henderson, not a great passer either. So I'm like, how much better does it really get if they? But I think it does. Like you said, I think if Nolan Henderson does get in there, it does help. You would think that Anthony Brown should have a pretty short leash here. But like you said, like you can't really assume any kind of logic from this coaching staff. So like in my mind, I'm like, can we give Nolan Henderson 3 quarters potentially, just like Anthony Brown potentially throws an interception, they replace him right away. But I'm not sure if they would, even if he threw a first quarter interception. Ultimately, like, yeah, Justin Hall, talented receiver, very involved in the game. Hard not to have like some interest in him, but what is hang on one second. Justin Hall getting, it's kind of a lot of ownership for his price tag. Yeah, I think I'm going to be overweight on a lot of running backs. I think I'll be underweight to the 22% we have Justin Hall projected at. Like, just he's too expensive for that. Now he got there last week with a late garbage time touchdown. Obviously that could happen once again, but yeah, I think I'll be underweight to Justin Hall. How about you?
Yeah, I probably will be too. That might be an ownership number that I need to adjust though. Like maybe something like 15% makes a little bit more sense for a guy like Hall. Shout out to Noto M in the chat, by the way, who noted that, Hall was a Henderson guy last year. Nolan Henderson did target Justin Hall a significant amount. Part of that too was also because the team just increased Hall's involvement in the second half of the year. But still, I think Nolan Henderson overall is a lot better for Justin Hall. I'm not really sure I can get to these other guys here. Kiki Chisholm is probably just a little bit too expensive. He has good touchdown equity. They're very dinosaur-y in the way they run this offense. So they see a 6'4" receiver and they say, we're going to throw him jump balls in the end zone. That's good. Outside of that, he doesn't really offer too much. Lawrence Keys actually played quite a bit last week. Let me pull up the numbers here. Lawrence Keys was at a 78% route share, and he is only 3,000, I believe.
Yeah.
3,000. So 3,000 for a guy who's full time. I'd definitely prefer him to Chisholm. I guess I'd probably still take Hall over Keys because the floor for a guy like Keys is close to zero. But yeah, 3,000 for a guy who's going to be a full time player. I think that's a pretty solid bet there. We'll want to pay attention to the depth charts as they drop. But I would expect Lawrence Keys to be out there because these other wide receivers. I mean, Emmanuel Butler, I think, has some talent, but TJ Vasher is terrible. So I'd still expect Keys to get a good amount of playing time regardless. All right, we covered.
I think I have more interest. I just want to say I have more interest than you do in both Chisholm and Keys. Like I just think the $3,000 price tag, just given his role, like you don't really need 15 fantasy points to pay off that 3,000. Like he can get there if he puts up 9 fantasy points or 8 whatever, and that allows you to pay up for all of the really good running backs. I have some interest in Keys and Chisholm. Like again, like he was out there. He did not have a great game last week. But I think if we do see a little bit more Nolan Henderson, maybe they have a little bit more success. And also they're going to be playing from behind. As Naughty M says, entire second half will be garbage time. Like that doesn't hurt for receivers. It hurts.
That's true.
Obviously the running backs. I noticed you didn't even mention Lorenzo Lingard, the starting running back. He just right past him.
Yeah, that was a disaster last week. I actually played Lingard in cash. I actually did pretty well in cash despite Lingard only scoring 0.4 points, which blew my mind. But yeah, I mean, they just weren't utilizing him at all. He was basically just a spell for Kirk Merritt. And when he was on the field, he wasn't getting the ball. Like I said, I really anticipate based on the way they were using these backs last week, that if they get inside the 5, it's going to be Merritt.
Probably.
So, and again, this is a game where we project a lot of garbage time for Houston. Like, Noto M said, entire second half could be garbage time here. That's going to be all Kirk Merritt. I don't think they want Lingard on the field for passing downs basically at all. So yeah, that's why I skipped over Lorenzo Lingard. Just didn't really find it necessary. It could be Zaquandre White active instead of Lingard this week. And if he's listed as the RB1, I'm still going to project him, about the same as we have Lingard projected right now, which is for, not more than probably 4 or 5 fantasy points.
Yeah.
Alrighty, Neil, we can move on to the Arlington Renegades side of this football game. I think this backfield is what I want to talk about first, because this backfield usage was, mind-blowing last week. I did not think in a million years that Day Hunter was live for 16 carries in week 1. Now, keep in mind, Arlington loves to run between the tackles. They have a ton of stuff where it's just ground and pound. We're trying to gain 3, 4, 5 yards. Day Hunter weighs 40 pounds less than Kalen Ballage. I believe 35 pounds less than Davion Smith. There's a huge size difference there. And that's why, again, I was so surprised that Day Hunter absolutely dominated in terms of usage. He led the backfield in weighted opportunity, only ended up at 50% because Davion Smith, obviously grabbed those carries at the 1, and then Kalen Ballage also saw decent usage there. But this is just a really, really tough backfield to dissect. Now, the upside case is, I will say, I'm only really considering Ballage and Hunter. A guy like Davion Smith, 3 snaps last week, all from the 1-yard line, 3 carries, 3 touchdowns. Infuriating stat line for those of us playing DFS. And I just really don't think that you can touch him for any sort of tournament or anything like that. Bob Stoops seemed to indicate that he's really excited to get Davion touches in short yardage stuff. I know Chris Wecht, who helps me out with projections in the background, he's one of the best employees here at Fantasy Points. He was like, you cannot project Davion for a 13% touchdown rate. I think I bumped it down to like 10, but I mean, man, it really does feel like, when Davion touches the ball, it's likely going to be at the goal line to score. But, with that out of the way, Day Hunter, Kalen Ballage, I think are both very interesting plays, in large part because, we expect Arlington to have a massive lead here. So that, lends itself to them running the ball a ton like we saw last week. And this Houston run defense got absolutely gashed by St. Louis, gave up 275 rushing yards to the St. Louis Battlehawks. I don't expect Arlington to be that efficient, but this, at least based on what we saw in week 1, could easily be the best rushing matchup that any team has. And again, super positive game script. What are your thoughts on Day Hunter versus Kalen Ballage? I'm sort of going back and forth in my head about these two.
I still think I prefer Kalen Ballage. Okay. He got the first crack. The ultimate lines did not look like he was the clear bell cow there, but I still think he's probably the more talented of the two. I don't know. It is tough because they use Davion at the goal line, so we can't really give that to anybody.
I will say that both Ballage and Day Hunter earned inside the 5 carries last week. They only got the ball to 1 though, and then they gave it to Davion Smith. So both players, I think, have pretty strong touchdown equity. Day Hunter led all running backs last week with 6 red zone carries, which, again, is one of those stats that just blew my mind. I really thought he would just be a pass down, third down, handful of carries type of back. Doesn't seem to be the case at all.
Yeah. It is tough because Ballage, I think, as I recall, most of his success was pretty early in that game. Then it was more Day Hunter in the second half of the game.
Yeah.
And it was like they had a big lead for the entire second half. Now in the UFL, you can come back from a 20-point deficit in the fourth quarter much easier than you can in the NFL. So it's like garbage time doesn't really apply in the same way. I'm not trying to say all of Day Hunter's usage was in garbage time, or a majority of it was, but maybe there's a little bit something to that. Maybe they would prefer Ballage in a closer game. So and there's so much positive coach speak for Kalen Ballage prior to the year. So I don't know. I still think it's probably Ballage would be the one that I expect for the majority of the season to see the higher workload here. So I do like Kalen Ballage somewhat. Now he's 8,000, so he's fairly expensive relative to Day Hunter at 5,500. So yeah, I think Kalen Ballage more likely to see heavier workload. I think he's pretty talented. I think the ownership is fair on Ballage, but still Day Hunter at 5,500 and 10% ownership. Maybe from a DFS perspective, even though I think Kalen Ballage probably gets more of the workload from a DFS perspective, it's actually pretty close, just given the salary and the ownership there. So I'm kind of going back and forth here. How do you see it between these two?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, man, I'm kind of going back and forth as well. I would give a slight preference to Ballage. Largely just because I think he's the better back. I think when the Arlington coaches watched the film back last week, I mean, Ballage was right around 7-8 yards per carry. Day Hunter really wasn't doing anything with his carries between the tackles. I really hope that film sort of smacks him over the head and makes them think Ballage should be getting closer to 15 carries. Hunter should maybe be closer to 6 to 8 carries. Which I think would be, sort of the split that they land on at some point, but you can't really guarantee that that'll happen in week 2. Sometimes it takes, several weeks of data and film and just watching these guys go before coaches come to that sort of realization. So I like Ballage a lot. I think he does have better touchdown equity overall than Day Hunter. I mean, last week we saw Arlington scored all of those Davion Smith touchdowns out of the T formation. Day Hunter was not on the field for those plays. Kalen Ballage was. It just so happened to go to Davion Smith every time. I mean, there was certainly a world where if they just ran that play in the opposite direction, Kalen Ballage scored 3 touchdowns and ended the week with 40 DraftKings points. And yeah, Don G noted he was first place in the winning team in the flagship last week. I believe he was on pretty much every team in the top 5. Really sharp play for those who played Ballage. I was overweight. Unfortunately, didn't quite work out for me. Yeah.
Was he talking about Ballage or was he talking about Davion Smith? I thought he was talking about Davion Smith there.
I believe he was talking about Ballage. I don't think Davion Smith cracked the winning lineup in the main flagship.
It was like
Davion
half
Smith
a percent owned. Yeah,
did crack the winning lineup in the 5K to first showdown for that slate, which also led to me tilting my face off because I think I was bouncing between second and fourth. It was me and Furby kind of
that's right. Yeah, you guys were. I remember
all day, and then Davion Smith scores the 3rd touchdown. John Lovett scores in the final 5-6 minutes, and I finished like 40th. It was brutal.
Yeah.
All right. In terms of pass catchers here, Arlington sort of did something pretty interesting. We know who Luis Perez is, right? He's a pocket passer and he probably won't be forced to throw a ton. So I am curious on your thoughts on him. But before we get there, I did want to note, I was expecting, more generally because training camps are so short in spring football. We see teams really stick with wide receivers at individual positions. If a guy is a slot receiver, he plays slot almost every single snap. And that's true across the league. Arlington kept the same group of wide receivers together that they had last season. And I think they used that, that advantage of keeping or of the continuity to teach all these wide receivers the varying wide receiver positions. We saw Isaiah Winstead, Deontay Burnett, even Tyler Vaughn's rotating in the slot outside way more than we saw last year, which makes the projections a little tougher. But I will say, in terms of route share leaders, it was pretty straightforward. Sal Cannella at 93%, Isaiah Winstead and Tyler Vaughn's both at 75%, Deontay Burnett at 64%, and Javonte Payton at 54%. After that, pretty big drop off before you get to a guy like Lawan Winningham. So, yeah, Neil, where are you at on Perez? Where are you at on stacking him with these pass catchers? I think Winstead and Cannella probably stand out the most to me right now, but I mean, it's tough because I just worry that he's not going to get pushed enough for, say a Perez double stack to really get you there.
Yeah. I mean, we don't run double stacks as often anyway, I think. So like you can run Perez single stacks just fine. I think, I think the ownership is low enough on Perez that I think I'll probably get there. Like we have him at 10%. That feels fair. Like Perez, we've seen the upside and more so like the second half of last year, and it continued into week 1 where he looked really good. So I actually think I'll be overweight to 10% Perez. I think I'm accepting that he might just be better than I think he is because he started pretty poor last year. But he was pretty good towards the end of the year, good in week 1. So I do think Perez is, pretty playable at 10%. I think I'll be overweight to that number. As far as players, and I'm according to Wednesdays with Wade Phillips, did not think Perez was that much better than Kellen Mond for the record. But wow. I think from a DFS perspective, he was a little bit better there. Sal Cannella, he's 8,600 is the one and getting a fair amount of ownership, but like he's still pretty clearly like one of the top pass catchers in the league. I think he's a strong play if you can get there, willing to certainly go to Sal Cannella. Same thing, Tyler Vaughn's. He's 7,700. Feels like a pretty strong play to me there as well. I probably eat that ownership on Vaughn's. I don't know. It's 23% kind of a lot, but it's not like crazy. Yeah, I think that's a fair ownership number. Isaiah Winstead, 4,400. Yeah, I like it. He was pretty involved last week. He was listed as a starter. Then they played him like a starter. So I do think Winstead is a player I have interest in. And then we have the, Deontay Burnett, JP Payton. I don't know. Burnett seems to have a better role than he had last year. So playable. What's the price tag on Burnett? 6,100. Very little ownership. I guess at that ownership number, I do like Burnett. I would be certainly overweight to 2%. I think I'd be overweight to Burnett, Payton, Winstead. I could be overweight to all 3 of those. So I think I'm more like I like the primary receivers, but more like I'll be closer to the field. But I think the secondary receivers actually intrigue me, like from a taking an overweight approach. I think in a large field contest, like I think they all kind of have that upside. They showed it at various times last year. I think they have the talent. Deontay Burnett a couple of years ago was awesome, and I think like you said, like now they're moving them all over the field. Like sure, let's take shots. I think it's worth taking shots on not just the primary receivers, but the secondary receivers at low ownership are pretty strong plays to me. Do you like any of these guys?
I think that's a fair point. Winstead is probably my favorite overall, 4,400 for a 75% route share, running a lot of routes from the slot. Certainly tempting there. The Burnett play is interesting. I think, especially if I run out a handful of Luis Perez teams, I'll try to force in some Burnett. Only caught 2 passes in the scorebook last week, but he did also have 2 2-point conversions, which maybe suggests if they had to throw from the 5 on a play from scrimmage that, they'd draw something up for, it seemed like most of those plays were going to Burnett or Cannella, which is a little bit interesting. So yeah, I'd keep that in mind with Burnett. I don't want to go too overboard there because, again, I have a hard time seeing Houston push Arlington enough for these Perez stacks to get you there, Neil. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, in Perez lineups, forcing in a Kirk Merritt or a Justin Hall or a Lawrence Keys, Kiki Chisholm on like basically all of those. Cause I think you really need Houston to score a couple touchdowns for Perez to hit a ceiling.
I don't hate that idea. Like
Okay.
it's a small enough field that I don't know if I will require it in my optimizer, but I don't think it's a bad idea. Like, and I like those guys enough anyway. Like there are sometimes just like, well, the opposing team is so bad, I don't want to play any of their guys, but it makes sense here just because regardless, like even if they don't put up multiple touchdowns, if it's Luis Perez putting up, two passing touchdowns in the first half, which might be enough. If he puts up, 2 passing touchdowns and 200 yards, that could be enough in UFL. Those guys will at the very least be passing to try to catch up in the second half. So I do think that that's not a bad idea to include Houston run backs in those stacks. I was just going to point out. So Houston gave up, like you said, 276 yards on the ground last week. They also gave up 189 through the air, which was top half of the to fair. But Luis Perez is one of the more talented quarterbacks in this league too. So they're just giving up yards. It's not all on the ground. They give up a fair amount through the air also. So I do think Luis Perez playable, but then I'll be mixing and matching them. The more I look at the pass catchers, the more I think I'll probably have maybe double the field on Luis Perez. Like I think just lean into like it's a bad defense. Like sure, the game script probably doesn't favor Arlington passing a ton, but they could do most of the damage in the first half. They're still going to throw some in the second half, and maybe Houston does push back a little bit more than we're expecting. So I think Luis Perez. I'll rotate him, mixing and matching who I'm playing him with, but I think I'll be probably 20% or so.
Okay. Yeah, definitely like that. Taking a bit of a stand on Perez. Certainly interesting there. Shout out Don G in the chat. He pulled up the results. Davion Smith was on the second place team last week at 0.8% ownership. I mean, that is incredible. If you played Davion Smith, I mean, hats off to you. Was it a bad play? Sure, maybe, but it worked. So who am I to be critical?
Yeah.
All right, Neil, I think we are good to move on to the last game here. It is our San Antonio Brahmas at the St. Louis Battlehawks. I know attendance has been an issue. It certainly shouldn't be for this game. Brahmas are 7-point underdogs here. Total is 39.5. A couple injuries to keep an eye on. John Lovett was listed as limited on Wednesday with a hamstring. Hakeem Butler did not practice, on Wednesday with a hamstring. I do expect both players to suit up. Definitely worth keeping an eye out on today's injury reports and Friday's injury reports to see if they end up being active or going with any sort of injury status there. Neil, we can start with the San Antonio Brahmas, and much like Arlington, I think I just need to rant for a couple minutes about this backfield. Last year, and I wrote up a huge article on running back usage and sort of what I was expected from these different teams. Last year, Anthony McFarland was the single most efficient running back by both weighted opportunity differential and yards from scrimmage per touch, which similar to like yards per route run or first downs per route run for wide receivers, those are some of the most predictive metrics for just raw running back skill and future efficiency. McFarland, once again, was extremely efficient. He led the backfield in yards from scrimmage per touch. And yet, Neil, he only played on 25% of snaps. He only earned 5 touches. 4 of those touches came on a single drive in the second quarter. Now, I can't understand. I love AJ Smith. I love our Brahmas. I can't understand how they landed on that as the backfield rotation. We also saw John Lovett lead the way. Let me pull up the stats here. John Lovett led the way in terms of snap share and raw weighted opportunity. 10 total opportunities for Lovett. Jayshawn Corbin had 39% of snaps, 7 total opportunities, a little bit less in terms of raw weighted opportunity than McFarland, but still, I mean, this was a very, very confounding running back rotation for me. I expected McFarland to lead the way, and he just didn't. He just didn't at all. Neil, I don't know if any of these guys are playable. I guess if I had to pick one this week, it'd maybe be Corbin. But, like I said, 37% of snaps for Lovett, 39% for Corbin, 25% for McFarland. I mean, these are not snap shares that you want to see out of guys that you're clicking in DFS.
No, it's brutal. I mean, Anthony McFarland, 8,200. Like if Anthony McFarland was 7,000, I'd probably take a stance there and like just take shots on it. They're also, like you said, they're big dogs, which is good for Anthony McFarland, generally the bigger pass catching back.
You would think so, but Jayshon Corbin, 17% of routes, McFarland, 20% of routes, Lovett, 26% of routes.
Yeah.
So they split the pass game role up totally. I mean, Lovett 2 targets, McFarland 2 targets, Corbin 1 target. So this is, the grossest committee you could imagine for fantasy purposes.
It's disgusting. Yeah. And I don't want to read too much into a 1 week sample size where I think things just weren't working for them last week. So it is possible they go back to what they were doing last week. The Dark Knight says huge investment opportunity on Brahmas future this week. 100%. That's my main take is like they really were terrible last week. Now they have a really tough matchup with St. Louis. If they lose this week, they're going to be like ranked last in like the power rankings. It's like they're just going to drop, and it's going to be because they had a really tough matchup this week, and they're a little bit, new quarterback, a little bit rusty, whatever. I still think this team has the talent to be there. So agree with that. Agree with
currently
on the Brahmas.
Neil, I just checked. This actually surprised me. I was mostly just looking at Michigan and Birmingham. I guess I didn't move my eyes down far enough. San Antonio plus 1,700 for the UFL championship right now. They made the championship game last year, and I think this team definitely has the potential to be roughly as good as they were last season. So I think that's really interesting right now. And especially if they lose to St. Louis, we might get like a plus 2,500, plus 2,800, something like that. That would look really good in a futures portfolio that maybe also includes a little bit of Birmingham or Michigan.
Prior to last week, Wade Phillips seemed pretty confident that they were more talented than they were last year. Like, he seemed excited about the team. And he's, he's right there. He knows. So I think that is a good bet. One thing that Wade Phillips mentioned last week is that they just didn't tackle at all last week, and apparently they didn't practice tackling. Like, he basically said, that's on me. We needed to practice tackling. We didn't really do it. So it's like, okay, I guess they didn't really practice tackling that much prior to last week, and that's going to be a big emphasis this week. Now I don't know if you can really how much you can improve it in 1 week, but it does make me think like maybe their preparation from a tackling standpoint was not there, because man, that the 77-yard touchdown was just like two guys ran into each other right when they were about to tackle. Was it I forget,
it was Balaj.
Balaj.
I will say that, like, as you move up higher levels in football, they do less and less full contact stuff because the injury risk in practice is just too great. From what I understand, based on like reading training camp reports and stuff, even the scrimmages they were doing against other teams were not, tackled to the ground. It was kind of just give the guy a pop and let him go. So not surprised to hear that they didn't practice a ton of tackling, but they certainly looked like they didn't practice much tackling last week.
Bad. Yeah. And that was so I guess to that point, he also mentioned that both they had 2 practices against other teams and they dominated both of them. There was like, we had 6 touchdowns and they had 2 or whatever. So it was, he thought the team was going to be a lot better than they were. But then I guess the one part you don't see in those practices is the tackling, which was obviously a pretty huge issue for the Brahmas last week. So anyway, we're spending a lot of time talking about the stuff that's not. I guess it is kind of relevant. It is relevant for DFS, but not like directly. Also, he was asked any changes to the lineup. He said, no, not really. We may have a few guys back, but he mentioned specifically the left tackle. So maybe the offensive line gets a little bit better. But I think generally it sounded like the rotation that they had last week is kind of what we're expecting. From a running back standpoint, so that was the other thing. So this is coming back to it, was we didn't particularly run the ball well. That's our emphasis this week. I kind of wonder if the split was just because nothing was working. Like they tried Anthony McFarland, wasn't doing that well. They tried Lovett. I don't know. So it might have been just like they couldn't figure out what was working last week, and maybe they could get a little bit more condensed when they do figure out something that works. But mostly I just don't want to read too much into a 1 week sample of a disgusting split, when last year it was like Anthony McFarland had a pretty strong role. So I think I don't know. He is getting, what's the ownership there on McFarland?
Probably close to 0 would be.
Oh, it is. So at 0%, just given how good he was last year. And there were weeks last year where it was like, we didn't play Anthony McFarland because he had a bad role. There was at least 1 week last year where it looked like John Lovett had taken over. You can't really play McFarland. And then he had an awesome DFS day. So I do think at 0% ownership in the larger field contest, I think Anthony McFarland is somebody that I want to have a few shares of at the very least. Like get a little bit of exposure there, because I think he does have 25 fantasy point upside in him. I think of the 3 of them, he's the one that interests me the most.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I might give a slight lean to Corbin, but I'm with you in terms of who's the most likely to post a 25-point score. It probably still is McFarland, even with that really, really gross split. I mean, I did think the split last week was really weird. Like you said, nothing was really working. McFarland was still at 7.5 yards from scrimmage per touch. He only got 5 touches and, right around 40 yards from scrimmage. So he looked explosive to me. I can't really understand why they don't want him out there on the field more. Now, AJ Smith does follow me on Twitter. Maybe if I tweet enough about McFarland's efficiency, he will come around to playing him more. I might be able to subtweet AJ Smith into getting a few more reps for McFarland. So I'll try my best, guys. But again, this is a very, very gross backfield for fantasy purposes. I think the more interesting discussion, Neil, revolves around this passing attack. Kellen Mond, huge disappointment last week, but he has the advantage of being, one of the handful of quarterbacks that we are confident is going to play every snap. He played very bad last week. There was no risk of benching, no mention of a benching. I really don't think they want to go to Kevin Hogan, who is the QB2 here. So Mond's job is secure. And the nice thing is, it's relatively condensed here. Jontre Kirkland is still doing Jontre Kirkland things. They treated Jacob Harris, who's only 4,100 this week, kind of like Mike Evans. They were throwing him a lot of back shoulder fades, a lot of balls where he was using his size. He's 6'5", 210, using his size to sort of box out the opposing defensive backs. And he looked pretty good doing it. I would think a role like that probably carries pretty strong touchdown equity, at least better than what we saw from Justin Smith on the outside last season. After that, I think it gets a little too thin to really consider these guys. Maybe you could go to Greg Ward, maybe you could go to Marquez Stevenson, but the slot role in this offense isn't worth a ton, and they're sort of splitting it a little bit, which is gross. Ward got a little bit better volume last week, but in terms of route share, pretty close to a split. Neil, how do you feel about Kellen Mond, stacking him up with Kirkland, Harris? Where are you at on that?
Yeah, I will take the ownership discount on Mond. Like you said, we can have confidence that he's going to play, most likely going to play all of the snaps. I mean, Wade Phillips was pretty positive about him in general. He looked good to Wade Phillips. So I think he is pretty secure in terms of getting the snaps. I think he has some of the better pedigree. He has some running upside. So when he's getting single digit ownership, I think Kellen Mond, a pretty strong play here. I will go right back to that. Well, that's another one that I'm going to be taking a pretty overweight approach on. And like you said, we kind of know who we want to go to. Is Jontre Kirkland just probably the best receiver? Well, if everybody's at the same price, I think Jontre Kirkland would be at least top 2 or 3 in terms of ownership if they were all the same price. He is one of the top projected. I guess he is the our number 2 projected receiver on the slate. Just an awesome role. If Kellen Mond does turn it around, Jontre Kirkland probably coming with him. So love that pairing in particular. But like you said, Jacob Harris did look like a player who's going to be pretty involved last week. That was awesome to see. I think he looks pretty good. So I think we can certainly go there as well. I don't know. I think Greg Ward and Marquez Stevenson just involved enough that I would probably have a handful of shares in a 150 set. I think they both have enough upside there that I wouldn't completely X them out in a 150 set. I would want to have some, and they're not getting much ownership here. What do we have? We have
5% on Ward and
Ward
0
5%.
on Stevenson.
Yeah, and Stevenson, even though he was listed as a wide receiver too, he was pretty involved. He actually ran a fair number of routes, and we've seen him have success in the UFL in the past. So maybe just a couple games last year he was mostly pretty underwhelming, but we have seen him, and he wasn't in a totally full-time role last year either. So I think both Stevenson at 0% is certainly a player I want to be above weight on, and Greg Ward I think at 5%. I like him enough to be above weight on that also.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Like you said, Stevenson was listed as a backup. This is an offense that runs a ton of 10 personnel, 4 wide receiver sets. So your backup slot receiver is effectively a starter for you. And that's what we saw between Greg Ward and Stevenson last week. Final note on Mond was that, one of the props that I posted in our Discord last week was Mond over 22.5 rushing yards. He almost got there. We pretty much nailed his scramble rate exactly, but the design runs weren't really there. Only one designed run for Mond last week. I do wonder if maybe AJ Smith looks at that and says, I need to start running Mond a little bit more. We didn't really see them run any plays inside the 5, inside the 10. I think they only ran one play inside the 10 last week. So in that area, I could definitely see them going with some sort of QB power type concepts. We saw that from Chase Garbers last year. We saw that a lot from Cole McDonald in 2023 in the games that he started in the XFL. So I would keep that in mind. We might see Mond run a little bit more. I'm not really projecting that a ton. I'm largely going off what we saw last week, but that is something to keep in mind. The rushing touchdown upside might be there for Mond. Before we move on to the other side of this game, Don G asked if they did something weird with McFarland in week 1 last year. McFarland was at about 45% of snaps last year. I think the big difference between week 1 last year and week 1 this year was that it was a 2 running back rotation in week 1 last year. It was a 3 running back rotation where they were all notably involved this year, which again makes the backfield very, very tough to click in San Antonio. All right, Neil, it's the St. Louis Battlehawks, and then we can get out of here. Manny Wilkins in this rushing attack looked really good last week. I thought the new offensive coordinator, Phil McGeegan, I believe is his name, did a really great job designing an offense around Manny Wilkins, who is an extremely talented runner, fairly limited as a passer, very comparable player, I think, to Nolan Henderson, where they both just want to, when they drop back, they want to get out there and run about as much as possible. This offense was a ton of read options, a ton of screens. That's not great for a guy like Hakeem Butler, who kind of thrives on the deep ball. It is okay for guys like, Ja'Cour Pearson, Frank Darby. The real big thing with Wilkins, though, is just like he is an excellent runner, and that gives him probably the best floor of any UFL quarterback. I would imagine if you're playing cash this week, you're probably looking at Wilkins as your starting point in terms of the cash quarterback. Where are you at on Wilkins? How do you feel about stacking him? Because, considering the spread, considering how much St. Louis ran the ball last week, I believe they were only at a 44% pass rate. Hard to make an upside case for like a Wilkins, even a Wilkins single stack, especially a Wilkins double stack, I think is pretty much out the door.
I think a single stack is probably I think I probably would require a pass catcher with him.
Really? Okay.
Maybe I need to start thinking about playing more naked quarterbacks. I just go back to, I play so many large field contests. This is a smaller contest where maybe I should consider not doing that. But they have Ja'Cour Pearson, Hakeem Butler going to come in at reduced ownership just because of how last week went for him. And even if it's not like an ideal matchup for Hakeem Butler, he's smashed so many slates that he's a player that when you can get him at pretty reduced ownership, I do have interest there. So I think just because I do like Hakeem Butler, I like Ja'Cour Pearson. I mean, man, we have Ja'Cour Pearson at very low ownership. That really intrigues me if we're going to get Ja'Cour Pearson at single digit ownership. I like the pass catchers. Wilkins himself getting enough ownership that he's one that I'll be definitely underweight on, particularly against this Brahmas defense, which looked awful last week. But I think in general, it's a talented defense. They were good last year. I think they're going to come back around, and I think it could happen this week. So I think last week might have been, I'm counting on it being somewhat of a fluke last week, and it did. It looked pretty bad. Like some of the tackling was just like how do you not make that tackle? And I think that is something that is not going to stick week to week. So I think they're going to be a better defense going forward. So if you got a chalk quarterback against what should be one of the best defenses in the league, I am going to be underweight to the quarterback, but I think I'm going to play the pass catchers anyway. So
okay.
So yeah, when I have Wilkins, I'll probably be pairing him with a Pearson or a Butler. Those two primarily, I think, are the Darby. I guess is cheap enough. You can play Darby with them also. Yeah, I think. And actually, Gary Jennings is only 3,400. Is like sort of in play, I think.
Yeah, Jennings was out there for a decent number of routes, 75%, the same amount as Hakeem Butler, which is certainly interesting. I think the problem with a guy like Jennings is, this St. Louis offense has a pretty predictable like clear out role where a guy's just running go routes down the field on the outside. That's Gary Jennings. Yeah. Like we've seen Stephen Mitchell in the past. That's generally not a super productive fantasy role, but a 60-yard touchdown obviously changes everything when you're that cheap. So yeah. I think Darby and Gary Jennings are guys that I'd be fine taking shots on. Butler's probably my least favorite. I think I'm going to pinch the ownership between Butler and Pearson a little bit more than what we currently have. Butler did post a 0 last week. And again, I think in this read option heavy, screen heavy offense, Butler's role is not going to be as good as what we saw with AJ McCarron, but he is a big play machine, right? I mean, he's a guy who could take a slant or a go route 80 yards to the house at any point. So certainly want to keep that in mind, but I do think the floor for Butler is a lot lower than what we've seen in 2023, 2024.
We saw the floor last week. I mean,
we did. It was 0.
Also, came in with an injury designation. He's still got the injury designation, but I think like a week healthier maybe, and his one target was in the end zone, so like there's some value to that. Like he's clearly an end zone threat always, just given his size.
Yeah, and they ran a play from like the 15 or 20 where he was wide open on a post route for a touchdown. Joel Klatt was like, "Oh my God, you got to throw it." And I think Klatt is one of the best, not play-by-play, color commentary guys out there. He's really sharp.
Yeah.
Wilkins looked at him and then just decided to run instead. So, in future weeks, if that ends up being an actual throw, like Butler could have easily finished with 10, 12 fantasy points last week. So certainly something to think about there. The backfield, I think, is really interesting in St. Louis. We saw Jacob Sailors and Jarvion Howard actually finished 1-2 last week in weighted opportunity. Speaks to how run heavy St. Louis was in week 1. I'm really curious, Neil, where you're at on this backfield. I find both Sailors and Howard as relatively compelling plays. I thought it was at least a little bit interesting that Anthony Beck brought out Jarvion Howard as the only other player to participate in the post-game press conference. I was sort of wondering out loud in my article and, as I was doing my research this week, maybe there's a chance, Jarvion Howard was only at 35% of snaps in week 1. Maybe there's a chance he played well enough that they actually pinch these two a little bit more in terms of snap share and overall touches. Also interesting to me, this is a bit of a blowout spread. We saw Jacob Sailors with 9 carries in the first quarter. Howard only had 2. From that point forward, from second quarter to the fourth quarter, it was basically an even split. Now, Howard did play a lot more in the fourth quarter. I think they wanted to back off on Sailor's workload a little bit there. So don't want to put too much stock in that, but I want to give some space for there being a tighter split here than what we saw in the first half of week 1. Where are you at on these running backs?
Yeah, I think you said it well. Like my expectation is that it's the Jacob Sailors show. Like I think Jacob Sailors, as long as the game is close, like he was the best running back in the league last year. I think he's still better than Jarvis. Like Howard was mostly a garbage time play last week. Like you said, he played all of the fourth quarter. They're not playing Jacob Sailors when the game is out of hand, which I think kind of speaks to like they view Jacob Sailors as their star running back. So my main takeaway is if Jacob Sailors is going to be 15% owned, like, give me all the Jacob Sailors. I'm going to be well overweight on that once again. And San Antonio, as we mentioned, didn't tackle last week. They gave him 183 yards on the ground, which is again nearly 100 less than Houston, but still gapped the rest of the field. Like so they were by far the second worst run defense last week. And 1 week might not be enough time to totally fix all of those issues. So I have a ton of interest in Jacob Sailors. He's definitely a player I want to be overweight on. Howard to me is a little bit trickier because we have him at low enough ownership that, like you said, like, he may have earned a bigger role. So there is that. Like I think he was mostly a garbage time play, but a garbage time play who does as well as good as he did, then maybe he's no longer just a garbage time play. So I'm not as like I don't think I'll be above the 5% we have there, but I think that's a fair number for Howard. But mostly for me, it is Sailors because I still think Sailors, as long as the game is not out of hand, is going to be kind of a bell cow there.
Yeah, I think I'm right there with you. Another thing that I wanted to note with St. Louis is that historically speaking, and we did see it a little bit last week, they're pretty liberal with rotating these running backs even in the red zone. So like we might see a drive where they start at the 20, drive all the way down inside the opponent's red zone. All of a sudden Sailors gets pulled and it's Jarvion Howard just because Sailors is a little bit gassed. Something, I wanted to note as well there. But I think both backs are going to be pretty solid plays. The other thing that's nice about Sailors is like, sure, he's expensive. What is he, 10K this week? But we have plenty of salary saving options. So he's not necessarily hard to get to in your own builds. I think both players are pretty good plays, and we can really expect I think pretty great efficiency from both backs throughout the season. We see this all the time with rushing quarterbacks. Look up how Lamar Jackson running backs have done in terms of yards per carry compared to other running backs throughout the NFL. We see this at every level of football. Rushing quarterbacks really boost the efficiency of their running backs. Sure, they steal a little bit of touchdown equity, but much more likely for say a 40, 50, 60-yard touchdown run like we saw last week from St. Louis. Neil, that just about does it for our week 2 UFL breakdown. Before we get out of here, though, I wanted to ask you, Neil, obviously you're a big timer in the fantasy sports industry. You've won a lot of huge contests. Why are you playing UFL? What about the UFL appeals to you?
It's football. It's football in the spring. So NFL not available. I probably would not be playing UFL if we had NFL games right now. If I'm being honest, like I don't play college football DFS generally. But I love playing football DFS in general. I do think that this is a league that could continue to grow. So we're kind of getting in on the ground floor, just as like being fans, getting to know the league before hopefully the market continues to grow for the UFL. But yeah, the big thing is just like, I like watching football. I like playing, betting on football. I mean, for me, betting is mostly just DFS. Some like I did one underdog slip last week, which I did not cash. But yeah, just in general, like I enjoy betting on football, and UFL is what's available right now. And the product is pretty good. Like, and it's clearly not NFL level. Like you watch it, there are a lot more mistakes, a lot more. The coaching is a lot worse, I'd say, than the NFL overall. But it's still fun to watch. Still a lot of variance there. And they're talented. It's a talented league. How about you? What's the draw for you?
I mean, I'm in the same boat as you. Like, I love football. Football is pretty much the only sport that I gamble on. I'll do a little bit of college basketball when my Bearcats are good, because I really pay attention then. But man, I mean, I just love gambling on football. I think it's a ton of fun. I also love like sort of the second chance element of the UFL. Like, all of these guys are fighting their ass off to get back in the NFL. And for a lot of them, I mean, this is really the only opportunity you're going to get. Sure, you can go to the CFL and try to compete for a job, but then you got to be way further away from your family. You got to live in Canada. It's really cold there. So, I definitely see the allure of playing in a league like this for a lot of these guys. And I mean, it's clearly worked. We've sent the two best kickers in the NFL are spring football guys. Kevontae Turpin just got another 3-year extension with the Cowboys. Handful of other players from the past few seasons are still hanging on to rosters. So I really love that element. I actually asked Mike Nolan in a press conference what he loved about coaching in the UFL. And he was like, these are easily the most determined and just like nice to be around players I've ever encountered, because they're all like fighting their ass off to get into the NFL. Like, they have so much motivation to do it that they're extremely coachable. They're very nice, like just great group of guys. And I think that's really, really cool.
It's also, I just want to say, it's super fun having the mics on the players and the coaches and stuff. Like, just adds such a fun element. And like the interviews in game, which Wade Phillips in his Wednesdays played still references. There was one time with like 2 minutes left in a game last year, somebody asked him some question that he didn't like, or like kind of implied that he didn't know the rules or something, and he like brought it up last week in the first Wednesdays with Wade, like, I don't like being questioned about my decisions or whatever. So it's funny hearing from them. I mean, last week, Jake, I don't know if you caught the you called me a doorman.
Oh yeah.
That was so funny. That was so good. Yeah.
That was really, really interesting. There was also a play, I think, in that Birmingham game where they interviewed a defensive lineman who just caught a pick, and the guy was like, "How gassed are you?" And he was like, "Oh, I'm so gassed, man. I'm so out of breath." Yeah. I love that stuff. I really hope that they commit to getting more people in the stands. I think something like, it would be so easy to just say tickets are free, beers are $4. Put posters all over Memphis or, Houston, some of these towns that are really struggling for attendance. I hope they start doing some stuff like that. I think that's one of the best ways you could improve the product on TV, because it does feel like, I mean, it's like a flashback to COVID when we're watching the Roughnecks or the Showboats play in front of like basically nobody. Certainly tough, but we should have some higher attended games this weekend, especially given that we have one in St. Louis. Alrighty, guys. Well, wanted to thank everyone so much for commenting, for watching. We actually hit 1,000 views, Neil, on our show last week, which was awesome. I was super, for something this niche and this long. I mean, that is a pretty incredible viewership number. So obviously could not do it without all of our lovely subscribers and viewers. Really appreciate you guys a ton. And we will see you all at the top of the leaderboards. What?
Why are you shaking your head? You're welcome.